Hey guys, tonight we begin with the divine bureaucracy and cosmic instruction manual that is the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's begin with the concept itself. The Book of the Dead wasn't a book in the way we think of one. It wasn't a single, monolithic text with a beginning, middle, and end. It was more like a customizable, magical travel guide for the afterlife, a cheat sheet for the soul's final exam. The ancient Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is a much more optimistic and proactive title. It wasn't about being dead. It was about successfully navigating death to be reborn into the light. Think of it as the ultimate piece of supernatural luggage, a papyrus scroll packed with spells, passwords, and hymns, all designed to get you through the perilous journey of the underworld, known as Duat. No GPS, no travel insurance, and a serious lack of reliable celestial tour guides. The soul was, in essence, the original solo traveler on the most dangerous road trip imaginable, and this scroll was its map, its weapon, and its passport. The journey was fraught with peril. By night, the soul had to traverse a landscape filled with lakes of fire, terrifying demons, and gates guarded by monstrous entities with names like He Who Lives on Snakes. It was less of a peaceful transition and more of a mythological horror-themed escape room. You had to know the right spells to pacify the demons, the right passwords to open the gates, and the right hymns to praise the gods. To keep things from going completely off the rails, the Book of the Dead was often personalized. A wealthy pharaoh might have a beautifully illustrated, comprehensive scroll with over 200 spells covering every conceivable afterlife contingency. Think of it as the platinum-level travel package. A more modest official might have a shorter, more affordable scroll with just the greatest hits, the essential spells for not getting eaten by a crocodile-headed monster. It was a testament to the Egyptian belief that while death was inevitable, oblivion was not. They believed that with the right preparation, the right knowledge, and a very helpful scroll, anyone could conquer the darkness and emerge, triumphant, into the eternal light of the field of reeds. It was a system built on the idea that you could and should study for your final exam. Let's talk about the soul, or more accurately, the entourage that was the ancient Egyptian concept of the self. They didn't believe in a single, simple soul. That would be far too easy. Instead, they saw a person as a complex composite of different spiritual and physical aspects, a whole team of entities that made you, you. Basically, if you've ever felt like you're a collection of different, sometimes conflicting parts, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with ancient Egypt's favorite model of consciousness. First up, you had the physical body, the Khat. This was your earthly vessel, the hardware for your spiritual software. The Egyptians believed it was incredibly important, which is why they went to all the trouble of mummification. It wasn't just about preserving a corpse for sentimental reasons. It was about providing a permanent, recognizable home for the soul to return to. The body was the anchor that kept your spiritual aspects tethered to reality. Then you had the Ka, which is often translated as the life force or spiritual twin. The Ka was created at the same time as the physical body and was its exact double. It was the source of a person's vitality and energy. After death, the Ka separated from the body but remained in the tomb. This is why tombs were filled with offerings of food, drink, and furniture. It wasn't for the corpse, it was for the Ka, which needed these things to sustain itself in the afterlife. Think of the Ka as the ghost that stays home, the part of you that still needs its creature comforts. The most dynamic part was the Ba. The Ba is the closest thing to our concept of a soul or personality. It was what made a person unique. The Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird, which is a perfect metaphor for its nature. It had the freedom to travel. During the day, the Ba could leave the tomb and fly out into the world of the living, visiting places the deceased had loved. But every single night, it had to return to the tomb and be reunited with its physical body, the Khat, and its life force, the Ka. This nightly reunion was essential for the soul's survival. Without it, the deceased could not hope to be reborn into the afterlife. The Ba was the traveler, the adventurer, the part of you that could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And finally, there was the cage, the transfigured, glorified spirit. This was the ultimate goal. If a person passed the final judgment and their Ka and Ba were successfully reunited, they would become an Ak. The Ak was an effective, powerful spirit that dwelled among the gods in the field of reeds. It was an immortal being of pure light. So, the journey of the soul wasn't just a physical trip through the underworld. It was a complex process of integrating these different parts. The body had to be preserved, the Ka had to be sustained, and the Ba had to navigate the dangers of Duat to finally achieve the state of the Akh. It was a whole spiritual supply chain, and every link had to be perfect. Moral of the story: you're more complicated than you think. Always leave snacks for your ghost. And sometimes, the best way to achieve immortality is to make sure all your different parts are in the right place at the right time. The last breath left the body of Nebamun, the scribe not with a rattle, but with a quiet sigh, like the settling of dust on a papyrus scroll in a silent library. For a moment, there was nothing, an absence, a stillness that was deeper than sleep. He had been a man of order, his life measured by the neat columns of his hieroglyphs, the rising and falling of the Nile, the steady, predictable rhythm of the temple rituals. Now, that order was gone, replaced by a profound and formless quiet. Then, a gentle separation began, a slow, dreamlike unspooling of the threads that had bound him together. A warmth stirred in the center of his being, a fluttering sensation that was not a heartbeat. It was his Ba, the essence of who he was, the patient hand that held the reed pen, the mind that loved the poetry of the old hymns, the heart that had ached with love for his wife and with pride for his children. This essence, this personality, began to coalesce. It took on a form both strange and deeply familiar, a bird with the strong wings of a falcon, but with his own human head, his own face, still etched with the patient lines of a life spent in careful observation. He, the Bai of Nebamun, hovered in the air of the chamber, a silent, invisible witness. He looked down and saw the shell he had just vacated. His cot, his physical body, lay on the sleeping mat, its stillness now absolute. His wife was weeping, her cries a distant, sorrowful music that he could hear but no longer feel. Beside his body, a A shimmering, almost invisible double of it flickered into existence. It was his Ka, his life force, now unmoored from the flesh, an echo without a voice, its expression one of pure, silent confusion. His Ba knew, with an instinct far older than his 60 years of memory, that its great journey had just begun, and that its survival, and the survival of all his constituent parts, now depended on the actions of the living. He watched as the priests of Anubis arrived, their movements practiced and solemn. He saw them begin the long, sacred process of mummification. He felt a distant, intellectual curiosity as they made the incision and began to remove his organs, the parts of him that had sustained his life. He saw his heart, his ib, the vessel of his conscience, carefully set aside. It was not to be discarded. It was the witness. It held the complete and unerring record of his 60 years, every good deed, every harsh word, every secret shame. It would be his advocate or his accuser in the great hall of judgment. For 70 days, his Bia lingered in the twilight between worlds, a silent guardian of its own mortal remains. He watched his body being cleansed, dried, and wrapped in endless layers of pure white linen. Between the folds, the priests placed the sacred amulets, each one a magical key, a piece of divine armor for the journey ahead. And nestled over his silent heart, they placed the great scroll, his book of coming forth by day, the map he had so carefully commissioned. Finally, his mummified cot was placed within its coffin, his own face painted on the lid, a permanent, unchanging beacon, so that his Ba, the wandering bird, would always recognize its home. As his coffin was sealed in the darkness of the tomb, his Ba felt the first, irresistible pull. The sun was setting over the western desert. The gates of Duat were opening. The long night had begun. Let's talk about mummification, the ancient Egyptian art of turning your deceased pharaoh into a high-end piece of eternal luggage. Basically, if you've ever felt that your body is a temple and that it absolutely must be preserved for all eternity, with a complex 70-day ritual involving salt, linen, and the removal of your brain through your nose, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the world's most dedicated and slightly morbid preservationists. The whole point of mummification wasn't just to make a really impressive-looking corpse. It was a deeply religious and practical necessity. The Egyptians believed that the soul, specifically the Ba, needed to return to the physical body each night to rest and be rejuvenated. If the body decayed, the Ba would have no home to return to, and the soul would be lost forever, unable to reach the paradise of the field of reeds. So, preserving the body wasn't a sentimental choice. It was a prerequisite for eternal life. The process was a masterpiece of ancient science and ritual, managed by highly skilled priests who were basically the celestial equivalent of a 5-star mortuary team. The first step, and arguably the most gruesome, was the removal of the internal organs, which would decay quickly. They made an incision in the left side of the abdomen and removed the stomach, the liver, the lungs, and the intestines. The heart, however, was almost always left in place. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the record of a person's life. You were going to need it for your final exam in the Hall of Two Truths. Taking out the heart would be like showing up to the SATs without a pencil. The brain was a different story. They considered it to be completely useless, just a sort of skull stuffing. So, They would take a long, hooked instrument, insert it up through the nostril, and basically whisk the brain into a liquid state, which they would then drain out through the nose. No dignity, but very effective. Once the body was empty, it was washed with palm wine and spices and then covered in a type of salt called natron for about 40 days. This completely dehydrated the body, preventing the growth of bacteria. It was the ancient world's most intense jerky-making process. After the drying period, the body was cleaned again and stuffed with linen or sawdust to give it a more lifelike shape. It was anointed with fragrant oils, and its skin was rubbed with resin to make it waterproof. Then came the wrapping. The body was meticulously wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, a process that could take over 2 weeks. Magical amulets were placed between the layers of linen to provide protection, with the most famous being the scarab beetle, placed over the heart to protect it from testifying against the deceased during the final judgment. The final, preserved body was a mummy, a permanent, recognizable vessel, ready to house its soul for all eternity. It was a time-consuming, expensive, and frankly, quite disgusting process, but for the ancient Egyptians, it was the only way to ensure that death was not an end, but just a very, very long layover. The western horizon swallowed the sun, and with it, the world of light and form dissolved. For the Ba of Nebamun, the transition was not a movement through space, but a shift in reality. The solid, comforting presence of the tomb faded, and he was drawn into a current of pure darkness, a great, silent river that flowed into the heart of the night. This was the entrance to Duat. This was the first hour. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that was more than the absence of light. It was a substance, a primordial ocean of non-being. He was on a boat. He could sense it, a great vessel moving with a slow, inexorable purpose. He could not see the other passengers, but he could feel them, a multitude of whispering, rustling shades, all caught in the same silent westward current. The air, if it could be called that, was cold and smelled of damp earth and the faint metallic scent of distant stars. The silence was not empty. It was filled with a low, resonant hum, the sound of the universe breathing in its sleep. In this disorienting, formless void, the Ba of Nebamun felt a surge of what, in life, he would have called panic. He was untethered, a disembodied consciousness adrift in a sea of nothing. He reached out with a spiritual sense, fumbling for an anchor, for a piece of the ordered world he had left behind. And he found it, his Book of the Dead. It was not a physical scroll. It was a part of his very being now, an intricate pattern of knowledge that glowed with a soft, internal light, visible only to his new form of sight. The glowing hieroglyphs were his only lamp in the suffocating darkness. He clung to this knowledge as a drowning man clings to a reed. A voice, ancient and dispassionate as the desert wind, echoed not in his ears, but in the core of his consciousness. It was the first guardian. It demanded a password. It demanded to know the secret name of the first hour. Nebamun's BA focused its will on the scroll of his memory. The spell for the first gate, which he had commissioned the temple scribes to write, now blazed with a clear, undeniable meaning. He spoke the name, not with a voice, but with a projection of pure thought. The silent challenge in his mind receded. The boat moved on. He had passed the first test. As the journey continued, the landscape of Duat began to reveal itself. Through the second and third hours, he saw that this underworld was a vast, watery reflection of his own world, a great, serpentine river valley. But here, the fields were tilled by silent, shimmering shades, and the crops were stalks of ethereal, glowing barley. These were the blessed dead, the ones who had already completed this journey. It was a vision of hope, a promise of the paradise that lay at the end of this long night. But for every field of the blessed, there was a region of torment. He saw lakes of fire, their silent flames consuming the forms of the damned. He saw monstrous, knife-wielding demons herding souls bound in chains. It was a silent, terrifying panorama of the consequences of failure. His journey was a participation in the great cosmic drama. He was on the solar boat of Ra, traveling with the sun god through his nightly battle against the forces of chaos, his own small trial, a mirror of the god's great struggle. There were 9 more hours to endure, 9 more gates to pass, before he would reach the great hall where his own heart would be weighed in the balance. Let's talk about the gods of the dead, the divine management team in charge of Egypt's vast and complex afterlife portfolio. This wasn't a one-god operation. It was a whole pantheon of specialists, each with a very specific and crucial job in the soul's journey from death to eternal life. It was, in essence, a celestial corporation with a very clear organizational chart. At the top, the CEO, was Osiris, the resurrected king and god of the underworld. He wasn't just a manager. He was the entire reason the system worked. His own story of death and rebirth was the model for every human's potential for eternal life. He presided over the final judgment, but he was a benevolent ruler, the ultimate symbol of hope. He was the one you wanted to impress. The head of the mortuary and admissions department was Anubis. With his jackal head and his calm, goth demeanor, Anubis was the god of embalming and mummification. He was the one who oversaw the sacred rituals that preserved the physical body, ensuring the soul had a home to return to. He was also a psychopomp, a guide for the souls of the dead. He would take the deceased by the hand and lead them through the dangers of the underworld to the hall of 2 truths. And during the weighing of the heart, he was the one who actually worked the scales, the divine technician, ensuring the accuracy of the final judgment. Think of him as the calm, professional funeral director who also moonlights as the lead prosecutor in your final trial. The official court stenographer and legal counsel for the gods was Thoth. With the head of an ibis, Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, and magic. He was the ultimate intellectual, the divine librarian and record keeper. During the final judgment, he stood beside the scales with his scribe's palette, meticulously recording the verdict. His word was final. If Thoth wrote down that you were true of voice, you were in. He was also the author of many of the magical spells contained within the Book of the Dead, making him the guy who literally wrote the book on how to get into the afterlife. Then you had the board of directors, the 42 divine judges who sat in the hall of 2 truths. These were minor gods and goddesses, each representing a different district of Egypt and a different potential sin. The deceased had to address each one by name and declare their innocence of that specific crime. It was a full panel interview with the highest possible stakes. And finally, you had the muscle, the Divine Enforcement Division. This included Amit, the devourer of the dead, the crocodile lion hippo creature, who was the terrifying consequence of failure, and it included the many gate guardians and demonic beings who populated Duat. These weren't necessarily evil. They were just doing their jobs, which was to test the soul and destroy the unworthy. This whole system, from the initial preservation of the body by Anubis to the final judgment by Osiris, was a well-oiled machine. It was a bureaucracy, yes, but a sacred one, designed to ensure that the cosmic principle of Ma'at, truth, order, and balance, was maintained, even in death. The fourth hour of the night brought a jarring transition. The great solar boat left the watery paths of Duat and entered a new, terrifying landscape. The sandy, winding corridors of the realm of Sokar, a primordial god of the dead. The boat itself transformed, its hull becoming the body of a great serpent, allowing it to slither across the dunes of fine black sand. The darkness here was different. It was a dry, suffocating darkness, the absolute blackness of a sealed tomb deep beneath the desert. The silence was heavier, the silence of a world without water, without life, without echo. The Ba of Nebamun felt a profound sense of dread. This was the deepest and most dangerous part of the underworld, the very heart of the night. The path was a narrow, zigzagging passage, guarded at every turn by monstrous serpents with legs and wings, their stone-like eyes unblinking. Nebamun knew, from the glowing glyphs of his mental scroll, that to even look upon these guardians without the proper magical protection would mean a second and final death. He focused his entire being on the words of the spell. His silent recitation, a shield of pure knowledge against the terror of the path. He was a scribe, a man who had dedicated his life to the power of the written word. And now, in this place of ultimate darkness, those words were his only weapon. He spoke their secret names in his mind, and the great beasts recoiled, allowing the serpent boat to pass. As the boat journeyed through the fifth hour, a new vision of hope and mystery appeared in the sandy gloom. They passed the tomb of Osiris, a great, sacred mound from which the head of the resurrected god was said to emerge, a powerful symbol of the rebirth that was possible even in this desolate land. But the hope was fleeting, for this was also the domain of the great enemy. The ground began to tremble, and from the sandy depths rose the colossal form of Apep, the great serpent of chaos. Its roar was not a sound, but a wave of pure anti-creation that washed over the boat, threatening to dissolve it into nothingness. Nebamun watched in silent, spiritual terror as the retinue of gods on the boat sprang into action. Set, the powerful and chaotic god who was Ra's greatest protector in the underworld, stood at the prow, his great spear glowing with a fierce light. Isis, the goddess of magic, began to chant, her words weaving a net of power around the great beast. The battle was a silent, spectacular clash of cosmic forces. The serpent of chaos was wounded, driven back into the sandy depths, defeated but not destroyed, destined to return the next night, and every night, for all eternity. The experience was a profound revelation for Nebamun. His own small journey was not just a personal trial. It was a small part of the great daily struggle of the gods to maintain the order of the universe against the forces of oblivion. His own survival was inextricably linked to the survival of the sun itself. As the boat emerged from the sandy realm of Sokar and entered the sixth hour, the halfway point of the night, the darkness, for the first time, seemed a little less absolute. A subtle shift in the spiritual atmosphere suggested that the journey was now turning, slowly but surely, back towards the light. Let's talk about the negative confession, also known as Spell 125 of the Book of the Dead. Basically, if you've ever had to go through a performance review where you had to list every single thing you didn't do wrong, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the ancient Egyptian soul's final and most stressful job interview. The negative confession was the centerpiece of the judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. It wasn't a confession in the sense of admitting guilt. It was the exact opposite. It was a formal, ritualized declaration of innocence, a proactive defense of one's moral character. This wasn't a time for humility. This was the soul's one and only chance to present its case, to prove it had lived a life worthy of eternity. The process was meticulous and, frankly, a bit intimidating. The deceased would stand before the 42 divine judges, a terrifying lineup of gods with names like Eyes of Flame and Breaker of Bones. To each of these judges, the soul had to declare its innocence of a specific sin. The list of 42 confessions was a comprehensive moral and ethical code that covered a wide range of human behavior. It was a sort of divine rap sheet in reverse. Some of the declarations were what you might expect from any major religion. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. These covered the big, obvious sins. But the list went much deeper, revealing the subtleties of the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, or cosmic order. The soul had to declare, I have not been contentious. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not been arrogant. And I have not polluted the water. It wasn't just about avoiding major crimes. It was about living a life of balance, respect, and social harmony. You couldn't be a gossip, you couldn't be a jerk, and you absolutely could not mess with the Nile. This wasn't just about what you did, but also about the state of your heart. The soul had to claim, I have not been angry without cause, and my heart has not been hasty. It was a judgment of one's inner life as much as one's outer actions. The entire confession was a demonstration of knowledge as much as virtue. The deceased had to know the names of the judges and the specific sins they judged. The Book of the Dead provided the script, but the soul had to deliver it with conviction. It was the ultimate test of character, a final, comprehensive accounting of a lifetime. After reciting this long list of I have nots, the soul would then make a final positive declaration. I am pure. I am pure. I am pure. This was the soul's closing argument, its final plea before the scales were brought out and the heart was weighed. The whole process shows a deep belief in personal responsibility. The Egyptians believed that they would be judged not on their faith, but on their actions, on the sum total of their life's choices, big and small. The journey through the latter half of the night was a slow, steady progression towards the dawn. In the 7th hour, the Ba of Nebamun watched as the gods on the solar boat subdued more of Apep's monstrous allies. These were not just serpents, but grotesque demons, the very personifications of decay and ruin. He recited the spells from his scroll, his voice a silent whisper in the mind of the cosmos, his knowledge a small but necessary contribution to the great work of protecting the solar boat. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was an active participant in the great cosmic struggle. In the 8th and 9th hours, the landscape of Duat became less threatening. the boat sailed past long rows of seated gods, each in their own shrine, who offered their power to the sun god Ra as he passed. The blessed dead were also shown in various states of idyllic afterlife, their mummified bodies resting peacefully in their tombs, while their Ba souls were revitalized by the light of the passing god. These were tantalizing glimpses of the paradise that awaited him, visions of the field of reeds that strengthened his resolve and spurred him on through the remaining darkness. But the dangers were not entirely over. In the 10th hour, the boat entered a region of fiery pools and roaring subterranean waterfalls. The air, if it could be called that, crackled with the sound of destruction. Here, the enemies of Osiris, the damned souls who had failed the final judgment, were punished by divine, knife-wielding executioners. It was a grim and terrifying reminder of the alternative to paradise, a stark vision of the fate that awaited those whose hearts were heavy with sin. Nebamun averted his spiritual gaze, focusing instead on the protective glyphs of his scroll. His own physical heart, the Ib, preserved in its mummified chest, back in his tomb, seemed to beat with a slow, anxious rhythm, as if it knew its own great trial was approaching. He passed through the 11th hour, where the gods and spirits on the boat began to prepare for the final battle of the night. The tension was a palpable spiritual force. This was the final, deepest darkness before the dawn, the moment of greatest peril. He saw divine blacksmiths forging weapons of pure light, their hammers ringing with a silent, celestial chime. He saw the great goddesses weaving the final spells of protection. The entire underworld was mobilizing for the final, decisive confrontation. Finally, they reached the 12th and final hour of the night. This was the eastern gate of the underworld, the very threshold of rebirth. Here, the final and greatest battle with the Serpent of Chaos took place. Apep, now fully recovered and more powerful than ever, made its last, desperate attempt to swallow the sun. The solar boat was tossed on a sea of pure, anti-creative energy. The Bay of Nebamun clung to the spiritual railing, his bird-like form flickering like a candle in a hurricane. The gods fought with a final, desperate fury, and at last they triumphed. Apep was defeated, driven back into the darkest depths of the abyss, not killed, but held at bay for another day. The great solar boat, now whole and radiant with the promise of the new day, passed through the eastern gate. The transition was breathtaking. The oppressive darkness of Duat gave way to the soft, gentle light of the pre-dawn sky. Ra, now reborn as the morning sun in the form of the scarab beetle, Khepri, rose into the heavens, bringing a new day to the world of the living. For Nebamun, however, this was not the end of his journey. The solar boat had delivered him to his final destination. Before him, shimmering in the ethereal light of the underworld, stood the great gates of the Hall of Two Truths. His long, terrifying night was over, but his final personal trial was about to begin. He took a deep, spiritual breath, and, with the silent, jackal-headed form of Anubis appearing at his side to guide him, he walked towards the great hall, where his heart and his entire existence would be weighed in the balance. Let's talk about the heart, the Ibi. To the ancient Egyptians, the heart was everything. It wasn't just a muscle that pumped blood. It was the center of a person's being, the seat of their intelligence, their memory, their emotions, and most importantly, their conscience. Basically, If you've ever felt like your heart has a mind of its own, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian belief that your heart was literally your brain, your diary, and your moral compass, all rolled into one. This belief is why the heart was treated with such reverence during mummification. While the brain was unceremoniously scrambled and discarded, the heart was carefully preserved and left inside the body, or sometimes wrapped and placed back in the chest cavity. It was considered the most essential organ for the afterlife. Why? Because the heart was the witness. It had recorded every single action, every thought, every word, every secret impulse of a person's life. It was the complete and unalterable record of one's character. And in the Hall of Two Truths, this witness would be called to testify. This is where the famous weighing of the heart ceremony came in. It was the ultimate moment of judgment, and the heart was the key piece of evidence. The deceased's heart was placed on one pan of a great golden scale. On the other pan was the single, delicate feather of the goddess Ma'at, the personification of truth, order, and cosmic balance. The symbolism was profound and beautiful. The question being asked was, is the sum total of your life, with all its good and bad deeds, as light and pure as the feather of truth? The Egyptians had a deep-seated fear that their own heart might betray them during this crucial moment. They worried that their heart, filled with the memories of every mistake and every transgression, might speak out against them, confessing their sins and weighing itself down. To prevent this, a special amulet was created, the heart scarab. This was a carved beetle-shaped amulet, often made of green stone, that was placed over the mummy's heart. Inscribed on the back of the scarab was a spell from the Book of the Dead, Spell 30b. This spell was a direct appeal to the heart. It essentially tells the heart to shut up. The spell reads, "O my heart, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." It was a magical gag order, a divine injunction to prevent the primary witness for the prosecution from taking the stand. It wasn't necessarily about cheating the system. It was seen as a legitimate magical defense, a way to ensure that the small, everyday failings of a person's life didn't unfairly outweigh their overall goodness. It was a plea for the heart to remember the person's true character, not just their isolated mistakes. The fate of the soul rested entirely on this single, preserved organ. If it was light, eternal paradise awaited. If it was heavy, oblivion. No pressure. The Ba of Nebamun stood at the great bronze threshold of the Hall of Two Truths. The chamber before him was vast, its ceiling lost in a silent, shimmering haze of incense and celestial light. Down the long center of the hall, 42 imposing figures sat on thrones of polished granite, their faces a mixture of human and animal, their eyes ancient and all-seeing, reflecting the wisdom of the ages. These were the divine judges of the nomes of Egypt. At the far end of the hall, on a great throne of lapis lazuli and gold, sat Osiris, the silent king of the dead. His skin was the green of new life, and he held the crook and the flail, the symbols of his eternal authority. Beside him stood the veiled goddesses Isis and Nephthys, their presence a comforting, maternal balance to the sternness of the divine court. Nebamun felt a wave of awe so profound it was almost terrifying. This was the moment his entire life, and his entire death, had been leading to. Anubis, his silent, jackal-headed guide, led him forward. He did not feel the floor beneath his feet. He simply glided, a silent shade in a silent hall, towards the center of the vast chamber. He was brought before the 42 judges. His scroll, his book of the dead, unraveled in his mind, and he began to speak the negative confession. His voice was not his own, but a clear, formal tone that resonated in the great hall without sound. He addressed the first judge, "O far strider who came forth from Heliopolis, I have not committed sin." He turned his spiritual gaze to the next, "O fire embracer who came forth from Karaha, I have not committed robbery with violence." He continued down the long, imposing line, his voice steady, reciting the 42 declarations of innocence that he had studied in his life. "I have not been arrogant. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not polluted the sacred waters." With each declaration, he felt a weight lifting from his spiritual form. He was purging himself of the very potential for sin, presenting his soul as a being in perfect, harmonious alignment with the principles of Ma'at. When he had finished, he made his final, powerful plea. "I am pure. I am pure. I am pure." A profound, expectant silence settled over the hall. It was time for the final proof. Anubis led him to the very center of the chamber, where a great set of golden scales stood, gleaming in the ethereal light. Nebamun saw his own heart, the physical heart from his mummified body, being placed on one of the golden pans by the gentle, sure hands of Anubis. It looked small and fragile in the vastness of the hall. On the other pan, Anubis placed a single, luminous white feather, the feather of Ma'at. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, stood ready, his palette in hand. At the foot of the scales, a monstrous creature shifted expectantly. It was Ammit, the devourer of the dead, her crocodile jaw slightly agape. The sight of her sent a fresh wave of primal terror through Nebamun. Anubis gently released the arm of the scale. The two pans began to move, rising and falling with an agonizing, silent slowness. Nebamun watched, his entire existence, his past, his future, held in that delicate cosmic balance. The scales slowed, wavered for a single, eternal moment, and then settled. They were perfectly, absolutely balanced. The heart was not heavier than the feather. A sigh, not of breath, but of pure, unadulterated relief, rippled through his baw. Thoth dipped his reed pen into his palette and made a mark on his scroll. He looked up at the great Osiris and spoke, his voice the sound of rustling papyrus in a quiet temple. His heart has been weighed, and he is found true of voice. The field of reeds, or Aru, was the Egyptian vision of paradise, and it was a masterpiece of agricultural wish fulfillment. It wasn't a celestial city of gold or a garden of abstract spiritual bliss. It was, quite simply, the Nile Valley, but better. Much, much better. Basically, if you've ever felt that your idea of heaven is a perfect, eternally bountiful version of the place you already love, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the ancient Egyptian concept of the perfect afterlife. Located in the east, the land of the rising sun, Aru was a mirror of the best of Egypt. It was a lush, fertile landscape, endlessly irrigated by the celestial Nile. The weather was always perfect, the sun was always warm, but never scorching, and the harvests were always, without fail, magnificent. There was no drought, no famine, no plague of locusts, and no tax collectors. It was a farmer's utopia. Upon being declared true of voice, the blessed soul, now a glorified spirit known as an Ak, was granted passage to this paradise. Here, they were given a plot of land. Their eternal life was not one of passive rest. It was one of joyful, productive activity. They were expected to plow, sow, and reap, just as they had in life. But here, the labor was effortless, and the rewards were divine. The barley grew to a height of 7 cubits, and the wheat had ears 5 cubits long. It was a world of supernatural abundance, a place where the toil of life was transformed into the pleasure of eternity. The soul in Aru was not alone. They would be reunited with their family members and loved ones who had also passed the judgment. They could live with their parents, their spouse, their children, in a perfect, eternal continuation of their earthly relationships. They could also enjoy all the pleasures they had known in life. They could eat, drink, feast, and play games. Tombs were often decorated with scenes of the deceased enjoying these activities, a magical guarantee that these pleasures would continue in the field of reeds. It was a life of perfect, blissful normalcy. The Akek was also not cut off from the gods. They could see and converse with the deities. They were part of the celestial community, living in a world suffused with divine presence. They could even travel on the solar boat of Ra as he made his daily journey across the sky. But what about the work? Even in paradise, farming is still farming. This is where the Shabtis came in. These small, mummiform figurines were placed in the tomb and were essentially magical servants for the afterlife. When the deceased was called upon to perform any labor in the field of reeds, they could magically animate a Shabti to do the work for them. A wealthy person might have 365 Shabtis, one for every day of the year, plus overseers to keep them in line. It was the ultimate delegation of responsibility, ensuring that paradise could be enjoyed without any of the actual effort. Aru was the ultimate expression of Egyptian hope, a belief that the life they loved, with its fields, its river, and its families, was so good that the best possible reward was for it to continue forever, perfected and free from all sorrow. When the scales balanced and the great Osiris gave his silent, kingly nod of approval, a profound and instantaneous transformation occurred. Nebamun was no longer the frightened, bird-like Ba, a mere fragment of his former self. He was no longer just the sum of his disparate parts. He was transfigured. He became an Ak, a glorified, effective spirit of pure light. The heavy, shadowy substance of Duat fell away from him like a discarded cloak, and he was filled with a radiant, golden energy that was both warm and powerful. He was whole again, his Ka, his Ba, and even his shadow, the Shut, all perfectly integrated into a new, powerful, and eternal form of being. His long and perilous journey was complete. The great bronze doors of the Hall of Two Truths swung open without a sound, and before him lay a landscape of such breathtaking beauty that it made his former mortal life seem like a dream. This was Aru, the field of reeds. The air was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of lotus blossoms and the rich, earthy smell of ripe barley. A gentle, warm sun, the eternal, benevolent light of the reborn Ra, shone down from a sky the color of perfect turquoise. A great river, a celestial reflection of the Nile he had loved, flowed through the lush green fields, its waters sparkling with a light that seemed to come from within. He was home, but it was a home more perfect, more real than the one he had left behind. He saw other figures in the distance, their forms shimmering with the same golden light that now filled him. They were tending to the fields, their movements graceful and unhurried, their faces serene with a deep and abiding peace. As he took his first steps into the fields, two figures turned to greet him. His heart, the spiritual, perfect heart of his new Akh form, swelled with a joy so intense it was almost a physical sensation. It was his mother and his father who had passed the judgment many years before. They looked as they had in the prime of their lives, their faces free from the lines of care and age, their eyes shining with love and recognition. They embraced, a reunion not of sorrowful shades in a gloomy underworld, but of powerful, living spirits in a land of eternal light. They led him through the fields of impossibly tall barley to the plot of land that was now his for all eternity. It was a perfect piece of earth, the black soil rich and fertile, a simple, beautiful house, just like the one he had lived in on the banks of the Nile, stood by the water, a garden of lotus flowers blooming at its edge. This was his eternal estate. His new life began, a life of joyful, effortless work, of reunion with his loved ones, and of communion with the gods themselves. The scribe Nebamun, a man who had lived a good, simple life, had become a star in the eternal firmament of the Egyptian paradise. He had come forth by day. Let's talk about the amulets, the sacred bling of the ancient Egyptian afterlife. These weren't just decorative pieces of jewelry. They were powerful magical objects, a form of divine personal protective equipment for the soul. Basically, if you've ever felt that you need a little extra luck or protection to get through a difficult situation, and you believe a special object can provide it, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian belief in the profound power of the amulet. An amulet was an object believed to have a specific magical property, which could be activated by its shape, its material, its color, and the spells that were often inscribed upon it. They were worn by the living for protection against sickness, accidents, and evil spirits, but their most important role was in death. During the mummification process, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of amulets were placed within the linen wrappings of the mummy. Each one had a specific purpose, designed to protect a particular part of the body or to grant a specific power to the deceased in the underworld. It was a comprehensive magical armory, ensuring the soul was well equipped for the dangers ahead. The most famous and important of these was the heart scarab, which we've already discussed. But there were many others. The Jed pillar, a symbol that looked like a stylized backbone, represented the backbone of the god Osiris and was a powerful symbol of stability and endurance. It was often placed on the mummy's chest to magically ensure that the deceased could stand up and be resurrected, just as Osiris had been. The Tayet, or the knot of Isis, looked like a looped ankh and was a symbol of the goddess Isis and her protective power. It was often made of red stone, like carnelian or jasper, symbolizing the blood of Isis, and it was placed on the neck of the mummy to grant the deceased the protection of the great goddess. There were amulets in the shape of animals, each bestowing the specific power of that creature. A lion-headed amulet would grant courage, while a frog amulet, a symbol of fertility and rebirth, would help the deceased to be reborn. There were also amulets that represented parts of the body, like the Wajid eye, or the Eye of Horus. This was a powerful symbol of protection, healing, and restoration. It was placed on the mummy to magically heal any injuries it had sustained and to protect it from harm in the underworld. These amulets were not just passive objects of faith. They were seen as active magical tools. The Book of the Dead contained spells for activating these amulets, for filling them with divine power. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife was a place governed by magical laws, and that with the right tools and the right knowledge, these laws could be navigated successfully. The amulets were a crucial part of that toolkit, a physical manifestation of the magical protection that surrounded the soul on its final great journey. The Book of the Dead was not a single standardized text, but a rich and varied collection of spells that evolved over thousands of years. While we call it a book, it's more accurate to think of it as a genre of magical and religious texts, a tradition that was constantly being updated and customized. The spells themselves were known to the Egyptians as RW, which can be translated as utterances or spells, and they were the very heart of the soul's defense system. The total number of known spells is around 200, but no single papyrus scroll contains all of them. Each scroll was a unique compilation, a personalized greatest hits collection chosen for a specific individual. The spells covered a vast range of needs and anxieties that the soul might face in the afterlife. There were spells for not dying a second death, for not having one's head cut off in the underworld, and for not having to eat feces or drink urine, which were apparently very real concerns. These spells were highly practical, designed to overcome specific, terrifying obstacles. Many of the spells were transformative. There were spells for transforming into a falcon of gold, transforming into a divine hawk, or transforming into a lotus. These were not just poetic metaphors. The Egyptians believed that the deceased could magically change their form, allowing them to travel freely and to acquire the powers of different gods and sacred creatures. By becoming a falcon, the soul could fly through the heavens. By becoming a lotus, it could participate in the daily rebirth of the sun god. Another important category of spells was designed to give the deceased power over their own body and the world around them. There were spells for giving a mouth to the deceased, for giving breath, and for not letting his heart be taken from him. These ensured that the soul would not be a passive, helpless shade, but an active, effective being, capable of speaking, breathing, and defending itself. The spells were often accompanied by short instructions or rubrics, which were written in red ink. These rubrics would explain how and when the spell was to be used. For example, a rubric might say, "This spell is to be recited over a scarab of green stone, which is then placed on the heart of the deceased." This combination of the spoken word, the written text, and the magical object was what gave the spell its power. The language of the spells was often archaic and obscure, even to the Egyptians themselves. They were believed to be ancient and divinely authored, their power lying in the precise and unchanging recitation of the sacred words. They were the keys to the kingdom, the magical passwords that unlocked the gates of Duat and allowed the soul to navigate the treacherous path from the darkness of death to the eternal, sunlit paradise of the field of reeds. Let's talk about Ma'at, the single most important concept in the entire ancient Egyptian worldview. Ma'at wasn't a goddess in the same way as Isis or Hathor. She was the personification of an abstract and all-encompassing idea, the concept of truth, balance, order, harmony, law, morality, and justice. Basically, if you've ever felt that there is a fundamental, underlying principle of rightness that governs the entire universe, and that your primary duty is to live in alignment with it, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. Ma'at was the cosmic order, established by the Creator God at the beginning of time. She was the force that made the world work. She was the reason the sun rose and set, the reason the Nile flooded and receded, the reason the seasons changed, and the reason society functioned. She was the opposite of Isfet, which was chaos, injustice, and social decay. The entire goal of Egyptian civilization, from the pharaoh down to the humblest farmer, was to uphold and maintain Ma'at. The pharaoh was the chief agent of Ma'at on earth. His most important duty was to ensure that justice and order prevailed in the kingdom. The laws of the land, the rituals of the temple, the structure of society, all were designed to be a reflection of this divine, cosmic order. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to live a good, just, and harmonious life. This meant being honest in your dealings, caring for the poor and the vulnerable, respecting your parents, and being a good neighbor. It was a deeply ethical system that guided every aspect of a person's life. And it was this lifetime of adherence to Ma'at that was put to the test in the afterlife. The weighing of the heart ceremony was, in essence, a final audit of a person's Ma'at. The feather that the heart was weighed against was the feather of Ma'at, the very symbol of the goddess herself. The soul had to prove that its life had not been a heavy burden of chaos and sin, but had been as light and as true as the principle of cosmic order itself. The negative confession was a declaration of a life lived in accordance with Ma'at. The 42 sins the soul denied were all violations of this principle. The goddess Ma'at herself was often depicted as a beautiful woman with a single ostrich feather in her hair. She was a constant, silent presence in the hall of two truths, the very standard against which the soul was measured. To be declared true of voice was to be declared Ma'keru, a state of being in perfect harmony with Ma'at. This was the prerequisite for entering the paradise of the field of reeds, which was itself a realm of perfect, eternal Ma'at. Ma'at was the thread that connected everything in the Egyptian universe: the gods, the king, the people, the natural world, and the afterlife. It was the belief that the universe was not a random, chaotic place, but a just and ordered system, and that every human being had a vital role to play in upholding its beautiful, fragile balance. The tomb itself was not just a final resting place. It was a magical machine, an eternal house, and a launch pad for the soul's journey into the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians didn't see the tomb as a sad, dead end. They saw it as a vibrant and essential piece of technology for ensuring eternal life. Basically, if you've ever felt that your home should be a fully equipped, self-sustaining environment that will last you for all eternity, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian concept of the tomb. The primary purpose of the tomb was to protect the mummified body. The preservation of the cot was non-negotiable, and the tomb was its fortress, designed to keep it safe from tomb robbers, from the elements, and from the ravages of time. But it was much more than a storage vault. It was a home for the Ka, the deceased's life force, which continued to reside there after death. This is why tombs were filled with all the necessities of life. There were models of granaries, of bakeries, of breweries. There were boats for travel, chairs to sit on, beds to sleep in, and even game boards for entertainment. These weren't just sentimental objects. They were functional equipment for the Ka. The walls of the tomb were covered in beautiful, intricate paintings and reliefs. These weren't just decoration. They were a magical, permanent reality. The scenes depicted on the walls were what the deceased wished to experience for all eternity. A noble might have scenes of himself hunting in the marshes, overseeing his agricultural estates, or feasting with his family. These images, through the power of magic, were believed to become real in the afterlife. The paintings were a perpetual source of sustenance and joy for the Ka. If a scene showed a great feast, the Ka could magically partake of that food for all eternity. The tomb was also a crucial point of contact between the living and the dead. It usually had a special room or niche, known as a false door, which was a stone carving of a door that served as a magical portal. It was through this false door that the being could travel in and out of the tomb, and it was here that the living would come to leave their offerings of food and drink for the Ka. The family's continued performance of these rituals was essential for the well-being of the deceased. To be forgotten by your descendants was a terrible fate. The architecture and orientation of the tomb were also deeply symbolic. Tombs were almost always located on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the setting sun, which was seen as the land of the dead. The burial chamber itself was deep underground, a symbolic connection to the underworld of Osiris. The tomb was a microcosm of the Egyptian universe, a carefully constructed environment designed to be a perfect, self-sustaining home for eternity, a place where the physical body could rest in safety while the spiritual aspects of the soul journeyed forth and returned, forever bridging the gap between the two worlds. Let's talk about the demons of Duat. The Egyptian underworld was not an empty void. It was a densely populated landscape, teeming with a vast and terrifying array of supernatural beings. These weren't demons in the Christian sense of fallen angels rebelling against God. They were, for the most part, a form of divine law enforcement, the celestial bouncers and border patrol agents of the afterlife. Basically, if you've ever felt that you are just doing your job, but your job happens to be terrifying, grotesque, and involves guarding a gate with a knife for a face, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the demonic denizens of the Egyptian underworld. The demons of Duat were a diverse and colorful bunch. They were often composite creatures, with bodies that were a nightmarish mix of human, animal, and inanimate objects. A demon might have the body of a man, the head of a crocodile, and have snakes emerging from its joints. Their names were equally terrifying and descriptive. There was he who dances in blood, the backward-facing one who comes from the abyss, and he who lives on the entrails of the damned. These beings had specific roles and jurisdictions. Many of them were gatekeepers. The journey through the 12 hours of the night was often depicted as passing through a series of gates or pylons, and each one was guarded by a specific demon. To pass, the soul had to prove its worthiness by demonstrating its knowledge. It had to address the demon by its secret name and recite the correct spell from its book of the dead. If the soul knew the password, the demon would allow it to pass. If not, the soul would be destroyed. These demons were not inherently evil. They were guardians of the sacred path, their job to filter out the ignorant and the impure. Other demons were punishers. In the fiery lakes and torture chambers of Duat, these beings acted as divine executioners, carrying out the sentences on the souls of the wicked. They were the instruments of divine justice, the enforcers of the laws of Ma'at. They were terrifying, yes, but they were a necessary part of the cosmic order. The most powerful and dangerous of all the demonic forces was, of course, Apep, the great serpent of chaos. Apep was different. He wasn't a guardian or a punisher. He was a force of pure, anti-creative energy, the embodiment of Isfet. His sole purpose was to destroy the sun god Ra and plunge the universe back into the primordial darkness from which it came. He was the ultimate enemy, the one true villain in the nightly drama of the underworld. The soul of the deceased, traveling on the solar boat, was protected from these lesser demons by the power of Ra and the other gods. But the constant threat of these creatures was a major source of anxiety. The Book of the Dead is filled with spells designed specifically to ward them off. Spells for repelling a crocodile, for driving off a snake, and for generally keeping the terrifying population of the underworld at a safe distance. The concept of the second death was the ultimate fear for an ancient Egyptian. It was not just the end of life, it was the end of existence. To die the second death was to be utterly and completely annihilated, erased from the cosmos as if one had never been. It was the absolute, final, and irreversible oblivion that the entire, elaborate system of mummification, tomb building, and magical spells was designed to avoid. Basically, if you've ever felt that the worst possible outcome is not punishment, but simply ceasing to be, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the deepest existential dread of the ancient Egyptians. The first death was the natural, physical death of the body. This was seen as a transition, a dangerous but manageable journey from one state of being to another. The soul, the Ba and the Ka, continued to exist. The body was preserved. There was hope for a glorious rebirth into the field of reeds. The second death, however, was a spiritual death. It was the fate of the wicked, of those whose hearts were found to be heavier than the feather of Ma'at during the final judgment. It was also the fate of those who failed the trials of Duat, who were destroyed by the demonic guardians for their lack of knowledge or purity. The instrument of this final annihilation was the great devourer, Ammit. When a soul was condemned, its heart, the very seat of its being, was thrown to this monstrous creature and consumed. This was the act that sealed their fate. The consumption of the heart meant that the essential components of the soul could never be reunited. The Ba, the wandering bird, would have no home to return to. The Ka, the life force, would have no body to sustain. The Ak, the glorified spirit, could never be formed. The soul would simply dissipate, its consciousness extinguished forever. The Book of the Dead is filled with spells specifically designed to prevent this horrifying outcome. There are numerous spells titled Spell for Not Dying a Second Time in the Realm of the Dead. These spells were a form of magical life insurance, a powerful incantation that the soul could use to protect itself from the threat of utter destruction. The fear of the second death also explains the Egyptian practice of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Sometimes, a pharaoh who was considered a heretic, like Akhenaten, would have his name and his image systematically erased from monuments and records. This was not just a political act. It was an attempt to inflict the second death upon them. The Egyptians believed that to speak a person's name was to make them live again. To erase their name was to destroy their existence in the afterlife, to cut them off from the memory of the living, and to condemn them to oblivion. The entire Egyptian vision of the afterlife was a high-stakes gamble. On one side was the promise of a perfect, eternal paradise. On the other was the terrifying abyss of the second death. And the soul, with its preserved body, its magical amulets, and its precious book of the dead, had to navigate the treacherous path between the two. Let's talk about the final, glorious stage of the soul's journey, becoming an Ak. This wasn't just about getting into heaven. It was about a fundamental transformation of the self, a spiritual evolution into a new and more powerful form of being. Basically, if you've ever felt that the ultimate goal of your existence is to become a transfigured, effective, and luminous being of pure light, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the ultimate spiritual ambition of the ancient Egyptians. The word Ak is difficult to translate, but it encompasses the concepts of being effective, glorified, transfigured, and blessed. It was the final state of the successful dead. It was what you became after your body was properly preserved. Your Ba and Ka were successfully reunited each night, and your heart had passed the final judgment. It was the graduation ceremony of the soul. The ache was not a ghostly, passive shade. It was a dynamic and powerful entity. It had transcended the limitations of its mortal form and had become a being of light, a star in the eternal firmament. The Egyptians believed that the stars in the night sky were the Aku of the blessed dead, shining down on the world of the living. To become an Ak was to join the company of the gods. The Ak dwelled in the field of reeds, the paradise of Osiris, but it was not confined there. It had the freedom to travel with the sun god Ra on his daily journey across the sky in his solar boat. It could ascend to the heavens and take its place among the imperishable ones, the circumpolar stars that never set. It had magical power, or Heka, and could influence the world of the living, often acting as a benevolent guardian for its living descendants. The living would often write letters to their Ak-Iker, their effective ancestor, asking for help or guidance. But this power could also be used for malevolent purposes if the ancestor felt they had been wronged or neglected by their family. The process of becoming an Ak-H was called Sak. It was a magical process of transfiguration, enabled by the recitation of specific spells from the Book of the Dead, known as the Sak, or glorifications. These spells were designed to spiritually equip the deceased, to give them the power and the knowledge they needed to take their place in the divine hierarchy. The Ak represented the ultimate triumph over death. It was the complete and total victory of order over chaos, of life over oblivion. It was the final, beautiful promise of the Egyptian afterlife that a human being, through virtue, ritual, and magic, could not just survive death, but could transcend it, becoming an eternal, shining, and powerful being, a living star in the great, silent cosmos. The sun had set, and in the deep, cool darkness of the tomb, a different kind of life was stirring. The Ba of Nebamun, the human-headed bird, felt the inexorable pull of home. Its long day of flying through the familiar world of the living was over. It had soared over the bustling markets of Thebes, had watched its son, now a grown man, teaching his own child to read the sacred glyphs, and had rested for a moment in the cool shade of the sycamore tree by the river where he had once courted his wife. These were the bittersweet pleasures of its new existence, a connection to a world it could see but no longer touch. Now, the darkness called it back. It flew through the solid rock of the tomb entrance as if it were mist and descended into the silent, waiting burial chamber. There, its other self, the Ka, the shimmering, ethereal twin of its physical body, waited patiently, its form sustained by the offerings of bread and beer that had been left that day at the false door. And there, in its magnificent, painted coffin, lay the third and most essential part of the equation: the cat, the mummified body, the permanent, unchanging anchor of its being. The Ba fluttered down, and, in a moment of pure, silent magic, it merged with the Khat. The reunion was a jolt of spiritual energy, a recharging of its very essence. The cold, inert body was filled, for a moment, with the warmth of its personality, and the Ka, the life force, merged with them both. The three parts were one again, and in that moment of reintegration, the journey through Duat would begin anew. The walls of the tomb seemed to melt away, and the burial chamber was transformed into the solar boat of Ra. The familiar, terrifying landscape of the underworld unfolded around it. The soul of Nebamun was once again a passenger on the nightly journey, through darkness and danger. But something was different now. It had been many years, or perhaps many centuries, since his first fearful passage. He was no longer a frightened newcomer. He was an Akh, a glorified spirit, a being of power and knowledge. He knew the names of the guardians. He knew the spells of protection. He was not a passenger to be tested, but a member of the divine crew. He stood with the other gods on the prow of the boat, his own spiritual light adding to the radiance that pushed back the darkness. He faced the monstrous serpent Apep, not with terror, but with a calm, effective resolve, his own whispered words of power joining the great chorus of magic that protected the sun god. He traveled through the 12 hours of the night, not as a trial, but as a sacred duty, a participation in the great, eternal cycle of cosmic renewal. And as the boat reached the eastern gate, and the sun god was reborn as the morning star, the Ba of Nebamun was reborn with it. It separated once more from its physical form, its energy renewed, its purpose affirmed. It flew out from the tomb into the new day, a golden bird in the morning light, a silent, benevolent guardian of the world it had left behind, a shining, effective spirit, an eternal testament to the great victory he had won in the Hall of Two Truths so long ago. Let's talk about the funeral itself, the procession of the dead. This wasn't a quiet, somber affair. It was a massive, dramatic, and highly public piece of theater, a final, grand performance designed to launch the deceased into the afterlife with as much honor and magical support as possible. Basically, if you've ever felt that your final send-off should be a major community event with a cast of dozens and a lot of loud, ritualized weeping, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the ancient Egyptian funeral. After the 70-day process of mummification was complete, the final journey from the embalmer's workshop to the tomb began. The centerpiece of the procession was, of course, the coffin, which was often placed inside a large, boat-shaped shrine and dragged on a sledge by a team of oxen or men. The boat shape was deeply symbolic, representing the journey the soul would take through the underworld on the solar boat of Ra. The family of the deceased walked alongside, their grief on full public display. This was not a time for stoic silence. The Egyptians believed that the public expression of grief was essential. The male relatives would show their sorrow by being unshaven and disheveled. The female relatives, especially the wife and daughters, would let their hair down, bare their chests, and cover their faces with dust. But the real stars of the show were the professional mourners. These were two women, often representing the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who had mourned for their brother Osiris. They were hired to wail, to tear at their clothes, and to sing beautiful, sorrowful dirges, their loud, theatrical grief helping to create the sacred atmosphere and to magically protect the deceased. The procession was a noisy, vibrant affair. Priests walked ahead, burning incense and sprinkling milk, purifying the path. Servants carried the vast array of grave goods that would be placed in the tomb: furniture, clothes, weapons, food, and the canopic jars containing the deceased's internal organs. The procession would wind its way through the village to the banks of the Nile, where it would be loaded onto a flotilla of boats to be transported to the West Bank, the land of the dead. Once at the tomb, the most important ritual of all would take place: the opening of the mouth ceremony. The mummy would be stood upright at the entrance to the tomb. The heir of the deceased and a special priest would then touch the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of the mummy with a series of magical instruments, including an adze. This ritual was believed to magically reanimate the mummy, to restore its senses so that it could see, hear, speak, and eat and drink the offerings in the afterlife. It was the final activation of the body, the moment the mummy was transformed from an inert object into a living house for the soul. After the ceremony, the coffin was sealed in the burial chamber. The grave goods were arranged, and the tomb was sealed, its secrets hidden until eternity. Let's talk about the canopic jars, the sacred Tupperware of the Egyptian afterlife. These weren't just decorative pots. They were the divine storage containers for the most important internal organs of the deceased, an essential part of the whole preserving the body for eternity business. Basically, if you've ever felt that your internal organs are so important, they need their own individual, magically protected storage jars with lids shaped like the heads of gods, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian approach to post-mortem organ donation. During the mummification process, the stomach, the intestines, the lungs, and the liver were removed from the body to prevent decay. These organs were considered vital for the afterlife. The deceased would need them to function in the field of reeds. So they were individually preserved, wrapped in linen, and placed into a set of 4 special jars. These jars were then placed in a canopic chest and put in the tomb with the mummy. Each of the 4 jars was under the protection of one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, who were, in turn, under the protection of 4 powerful goddesses. It was a multi-layered divine security system for your guts. The first jar, with a human-headed lid, was named Imseti. He was the guardian of the liver, and he was protected by the great goddess Isis. The second jar had the head of a baboon and was named Hapi. He was the guardian of the lungs, and he was protected by the goddess Nephthys. The third jar had the head of a jackal and was named Duamutef. He was the guardian of the stomach, and he was protected by the goddess Neith. And the fourth jar had the head of a falcon and was named Kebesenuef. He was the guardian of the intestines, and he was protected by the serpent goddess Serket. This system was a beautiful piece of religious and magical symmetry. The 4 sons of Horus were also associated with the 4 cardinal directions, connecting the body of the deceased to the entire cosmos. The lids of the jars, with their distinctive divine heads, were not just decorative. They were magical identifiers, ensuring that each organ was placed in its correct, divinely protected container. In the afterlife, the deceased was believed to magically reabsorb the function of these organs. The jars and their contents were an essential part of the reconstituted, eternal body. The heart, as we know, was usually left in the body because it was the seat of intelligence. The brain was just thrown out. But these 4 organs were deemed so important that they merited their own divine entourage, their own special jars, and their own place of honor in the tomb. It was a testament to the meticulous, detail-oriented nature of the Egyptian preparation for eternity, where no part of the self, no matter how humble, was considered unimportant. The Book of the Dead was not just a collection of spells. It was a masterpiece of ancient Egyptian art. The papyrus scrolls of wealthy individuals were often lavishly illustrated with beautiful, colorful paintings known as vignettes. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were an integral part of the scroll's magical function, a visual guide and a magical guarantee of the events of the afterlife. Basically, if you've ever felt that a picture is worth 1,000 words, especially when those words are magical spells, and the picture is a guarantee of your eternal salvation, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the magical power of the vignette. The vignettes were a visual representation of the journey through the underworld. They depicted the deceased interacting with the gods, navigating the dangers of Duat, and successfully passing the final judgment. By painting these scenes, the Egyptians believed they were helping to make them come true. The image was a magical reality, a permanent and unalterable vision of a successful afterlife. The most famous and most important of these vignettes is, of course, the scene of the weighing of the heart from Spell 125. This was the centerpiece of many scrolls. The vignette would show the great hall of judgment, with the deceased, often dressed in fine white linen, being led by the hand by the jackal-headed Anubis. It would show the great golden scales, with the heart on one side and the feather of Ma'at on the other. Anubis would be shown adjusting the scales, while the ibis-headed Thoth stood by, ready to record the verdict. The monstrous Ammit would be waiting patiently nearby, and in every single Book of the Dead, without exception, the scales are shown as perfectly balanced. This was not a record of what might happen. It was a magical guarantee of what would happen. The owner of the scroll was preordained to be true of voice. It was the ultimate visual affirmation, a picture that ensured the desired outcome. Other vignettes would show the deceased adoring the gods, making offerings to Osiris, or traveling on the solar boat of Ra. Some would depict the soul's successful navigation of the fiery lakes and the demon-guarded gates of Duat. Others would show the idyllic final destination, the deceased plowing the fields, sailing on the canals, or playing a board game in the shade of a sycamore tree in the field of reeds. These images were a source of comfort and guidance for the soul. They were a visual map of the journey ahead, a preview of the trials and the ultimate reward. They were also a form of magical activation. The image of the deceased successfully performing an action in the afterlife was believed to grant them the power to perform that action. The vignettes were a beautiful and powerful fusion of art and magic, a testament to the Egyptian belief that the world and the next world could be shaped not just by words, but by the enduring power of a perfect, sacred image. Let's talk about the geography of paradise, the layout of the field of reeds. This wasn't just some vague, happy cloudland. The Egyptians, being a deeply practical and orderly people, had a very specific and detailed vision of what their heaven looked like. And unsurprisingly, it looked a lot like a perfected version of the place they already knew and loved. Aru, the field of reeds, was a vast and sprawling landscape, but its core was a series of islands set in a great celestial river called the Waters of the Lily Lake. It was an idealized water-world version of the Nile Delta. The islands themselves were covered in lush fields of barley and emmer wheat, the staples of the Egyptian diet. As the pyramid texts stated, the blessed dead would become a living being, and he shall eat the bread of the gods. This was a literal promise. The afterlife was a place of eternal, supernatural abundance. But Aru was more than just a farm. It was a complete and functioning society of the blessed. It had its own cities, its own temples, and its own sacred geography. The souls of the dead were not just farmers. They were citizens of a divine kingdom. There were different regions within Aru, and the deceased might be assigned to a specific one. Some texts mention the field of offerings, where the primary activity was the presentation of food to the gods. Others speak of a great city, where the blessed dead could live in beautiful houses and walk along tree-lined avenues. The ultimate goal for many was to be in the direct presence of the great gods themselves, to join the entourage of Osiris, or to sail on the solar boat of Ra. The journey to and through Aru was also part of the experience. The Book of the Dead contains spells for sailing in the great boat and for entering and leaving the field of reeds. The soul was not confined to its plot of land. It could travel, explore, and participate in the great cosmic cycles. The vignettes in the Book of the Dead often show the deceased sailing on a small skiff through the canals of Aru, enjoying the eternal afternoon sun. They are shown playing Senet, a popular board game, which was seen as a metaphor for the journey through the afterlife. They are shown being greeted by their deceased relatives, a promise of a joyful and eternal family reunion. This vision of paradise is profoundly life-affirming. The Egyptians loved their life on earth so much that their greatest hope for the afterlife was for it to continue, but with all the negative aspects removed. There was no sickness, no death, no poverty, no sorrow. There was only the perfect, eternal rhythm of the seasons, the joy of family, and the comforting presence of the gods. It was a vision of heaven that was not a distant, alien world, but a beautiful, perfected, and eternal home. Let's talk about the Shabtis, the magical servants of the afterlife. These small, mummiform figurines are some of the most common objects found in ancient Egyptian tombs, and they reveal a fascinating and deeply practical aspect of the Egyptian vision of paradise. Basically, if you've ever felt that your idea of heaven would be perfect, if only you didn't have to do any of the work, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the purpose of the Shabti. The Egyptian afterlife, the field of reeds, was a paradise of agricultural abundance. But this abundance had to be created. The blessed dead were expected to perform manual labor, to plow the fields, to sow the seeds, to water the canals, and to reap the harvests. For a wealthy noble who had never done a day of manual labor in his life, this was a potential downside to paradise. The solution was the Shabti. The name comes from the Egyptian word for to answer, and that was their entire purpose. They were magical stand-ins, an enchanted workforce designed to answer the call to labor on behalf of the deceased. The Shabtis were small figurines, usually made of faience or stone, shaped like a mummified person. They were often depicted holding a pick and a hoe, the tools of agricultural labor, and a basket on their back. Inscribed on the front of the figurine was a spell from the Book of the Dead, Spell 6. This spell was the magical activation code for the Shabti. It was a direct address from the deceased to the figurine. The spell reads, O Shabti, if the deceased is called upon, if he is decreed to do any of the work that is to be done in the realm of the dead, you shall say, Here I am. The spell then lists all the potential tasks, from tilling the fields to moving sand, and instructs the Shabti to take the deceased's place. It was the ultimate magical loophole, a divine work release program. A wealthy person would want to be well-staffed for eternity. Ideally, they would be buried with 401 Shabtis. This included 365 worker Shabtis, one for every day of the year, ensuring they would never have to lift a finger. The other 36 figurines were overseers, each one responsible for a team of 10 workers. These overseer Shabtis were often depicted with a whip, a symbol of their authority, ensuring that the afterlife workforce was productive and well managed. The Shabtis were a testament to the practical, problem-solving nature of Egyptian magic. They saw a potential problem in their vision of paradise, the requirement of manual labor, and they created a magical solution. It was a way of ensuring that the afterlife would be a place of pure, unadulterated leisure for those who could afford it, a perfect, eternal retirement with a full staff of magical servants ready to answer the call. While the Egyptian afterlife was a complex system of judgment and potential paradise, it was also a place of punishment for the wicked. This wasn't a single, monolithic hell like in the Christian tradition, but a series of terrifying and specific torments that took place in various regions of Duat. This was the fate of the damned, the enemies of Ra and Osiris, those whose hearts had failed the final test. Basically, if you've ever felt that a just system requires not just rewards for the good, but also some truly gruesome and ironic punishments for the bad, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian concept of divine retribution. The punishments in the Egyptian underworld were often a dark reflection of the crime, a form of cosmic justice that was both brutal and symbolic. The primary place of punishment was the lake of fire. This was a great, fiery body of water where the souls of the damned were consumed. Vignettes in the Book of the Dead show these lakes, often surrounded by fearsome baboon-like demons who would drag the wicked into the flames. But this was not necessarily a final annihilation. In some texts, the damned were believed to be reborn after their consumption, only to be tormented again, a cycle of fiery purification. The punishments were often carried out by a host of demonic executioners. These were terrifying creatures with knives for hands and heads, who would dismember the bodies of the damned. The crime of speaking against the gods might be punished by having one's tongue cut out. The crime of rebellion against the divine order might be punished by being decapitated, your head magically separated from your body for eternity. One of the most feared punishments was being forced to walk upside down and to eat feces and drink urine. This was a complete and total inversion of the proper order of things, a state of absolute degradation. It was the ultimate humiliation, a reflection of a life that had been lived in opposition to the principles of Ma'at. These places of punishment were not hidden away in some separate realm. They were an integral part of the landscape of Duat. The soul of the deceased, traveling on the solar boat of Ra, would have to pass by these horrifying scenes. It was a constant and terrifying reminder of the consequences of failure, a powerful incentive to know your spells and to have lived a good life. The ultimate goal of these punishments was to protect the cosmic order. The wicked were not just being punished for their own sake. They were being destroyed because their existence was a threat to Ma'at. They were the embodiment of Isfet, of chaos, and they had to be contained and neutralized to ensure that the paradise of the field of reeds remained pure, and that the daily rebirth of the sun god could proceed without hindrance. Let's talk about the magic of a name, the Ren. To the ancient Egyptians, a person's name was not just a label. It was a fundamental and powerful part of their identity, as essential as their body or their soul. To know someone's name was to have power over them. To have your name remembered was to live forever. Basically, if you've ever felt that your name is a core part of who you are, and that to have it spoken is to have your very existence affirmed, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with the Egyptian belief in the magical power of the Ren. A name was given to a child at birth, and it was believed to be a vital component of their being for all of eternity. As long as a person's name was remembered and spoken on earth, they continued to exist in the afterlife. This is why the Egyptians carved and painted the names of the deceased all over their tombs and funerary objects. A stela, or stone slab, inscribed with the deceased's name and titles, was a magical guarantee of their continued existence. The offering formula, a standard prayer that was written in every tomb, always began with a call to the gods on behalf of the deceased, naming them explicitly. Priests were hired by families to recite these prayers and to speak the name of the ancestor, a ritual that magically provided sustenance and life to the Ka in the tomb. The name was so powerful that it was believed to have a life of its own. In some myths, the gods themselves created the world by speaking the names of things. The goddess Isis gained her great power by tricking the sun god Ra into revealing his secret name to her. Once she knew his true hidden name, she had power over him. This belief extended to the afterlife. The journey through Duat was a test of knowledge, and a key part of that knowledge was knowing the secret names of the demonic guardians of the gates. The Book of the Dead provided the soul with these names. By speaking the name of the guardian, the soul could assert its power over the demon and be granted safe passage. The most terrible fate that could befall a person was to have their name forgotten, or, even worse, deliberately erased. This was the damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. A pharaoh who was deemed a heretic or an enemy of the state, like Hatshepsut or Akhenaten, would have their name systematically hacked out of their monuments. This was a magical act of assassination, an attempt to destroy their existence in the afterlife by erasing the very record of their being. It was the ultimate curse. The name was the thread that connected the living to the dead, the past to the present, and the mortal to the eternal. It was a piece of the soul that lived on in the mouths of others, a magical vibration that could echo for all eternity. The Egyptians had a complex and nuanced view of the relationship between the living and the dead. The dead were not gone. They were simply in a different state of being, and the connection between the two worlds was a vital, two-way street. The primary responsibility of the living was to care for their deceased relatives. This was not just a matter of sentiment. It was a sacred and practical duty. The well-being of the Ka in the tomb depended entirely on the continued offerings of food, drink, and prayers from its living descendants. The most important of these rituals was the Feast of the Valley, a great annual festival where entire families would gather at the tombs of their ancestors on the west bank of Thebes. They would spend the day feasting, drinking, and celebrating in the presence of the dead. It was not a somber, mournful occasion. It was a joyful reunion, a great family party that transcended the boundary between life and death. But the dead were not just passive recipients of this care. They were powerful, effective spirits, the Ak-Ikar, who could and did intervene in the world of the living. A happy, well-cared-for ancestor was a powerful ally. They could act as an intermediary with the gods. They could protect the family from sickness and misfortune, and they could offer guidance in dreams. The living would often write letters to their dead relatives, inscribing them on pottery bowls and leaving them at the tomb. These letters were a fascinating glimpse into the everyday concerns of the Egyptians. A person might write to their deceased father, asking him to intervene in a legal dispute. A widow might write to her dead husband, asking him to stop haunting her or to help cure a sick child. This reveals a belief that the dead were not just distant, benevolent guardians. They could also be a source of trouble. A neglected or angry ancestor could cause problems for the living. They could bring sickness, bad luck, or even haunt the family home. The relationship was one of mutual dependence, a sacred contract. The living provided the dead with sustenance and memory, and in return, the dead provided the living with protection and guidance. This belief created a society where the ancestors were a constant and integral part of the family. The past was not a foreign country. It was a living, breathing presence, a source of power, wisdom, and responsibility. The family was not just the people who were alive now. It was a great, continuous chain of being, stretching back into the mists of time and forward into the hope of eternity, all held together by the powerful, unbreakable bonds of ritual and remembrance. Let's talk about the final judgment in a broader, comparative sense. While the Egyptian vision of the weighing of the heart is one of the most famous and detailed, the idea of a final, post-mortem accounting of one's life is a powerful and recurring theme in many of the world's religions. It speaks to a deep human need for a universe that is ultimately just and ordered. Basically, if you've ever felt that at the end of the day, you will have to answer for your actions, congratulations. You've spiritually connected with one of the most fundamental concepts of eschatology. In the Zoroastrian tradition, as we've seen, the soul is judged at the Chinvat Bridge, where it is met by a beautiful maiden or a hideous hag who is the personification of its own deeds. The judgment is an act of self-confrontation, the soul's own conscience determining its fate. In the Christian tradition, the Day of Judgment is a great cosmic event where all the dead are resurrected to face a final, public trial before God. The deeds of one's life are revealed, and the soul is sent to its eternal reward in heaven or its eternal punishment in hell. The judgment is absolute, performed by a transcendent, omniscient God. In the Islamic tradition, the concept is similar, with the resurrected souls gathered before Allah on the Day of Judgment. The mizan, the scales of justice, will weigh a person's good and bad deeds, a concept remarkably similar to the Egyptian scales, but with the judgment leading to either Jannah, paradise, or Jahannam, hell, after the perilous crossing of the Sirat bridge. What is so unique and fascinating about the Egyptian vision is its blend of the moral, the magical, and the bureaucratic. It was a deeply moral judgment, based on a life lived in accordance with Ma'at. But it was also a process that could be influenced by magic. The heart scarab spell, which instructed the heart not to testify against the deceased, suggests a belief that the system had loopholes, that one could and should prepare a good legal defense. And the process itself was incredibly bureaucratic. It was a formal, multi-stage audit. You had to know the names of the 42 judges. You had to recite the negative confession correctly, and your heart had to pass a literal weigh-in. It was a system that valued not just goodness, but also knowledge and preparation. While other traditions might emphasize faith or divine grace, the Egyptians believed that your salvation was something you actively participated in creating, both in life and in death. Your eternal fate was not just a matter of being good, it was a matter of being prepared. It was a final exam for which you were given the textbook, the Book of the Dead, and it was up to you to study. This vision of an ordered, predictable, and navigable path to salvation is a testament to the Egyptian love of order and their profound belief in a just and balanced cosmos.